Newport, summer of 1895. The sea glitters like crystal, the mansions blaze with light. And yet, at the center of a grand garden party, one woman sits alone. Morgan Ashbourne, the magnate's forgotten wife, is humiliated in front of all society while her cold husband looks on. That night, she makes a decision that will shatter the rules of her world. She will stop begging for his love, and in doing so, force him to face a past he has buried and a future he never planned to choose. Tell me in the comments where you're listening from. And one question, what do you love most about historical romances? Newport, Rhode Island. Summer of 1895. The sea lay still as polished glass beneath the morning sun, and the great mansions along Bellevue Avenue shimmered like palaces carved from dreams. Yet for Morgan Ashbourne, returning to her summer home did not feel like entering a world of luxury. It felt like stepping once more into a quiet cage, built of marble, etiquette, and a marriage that had frozen long before the season began. The Ashbourne residence waited in immaculate silence when she arrived. The tall windows gleamed, the manicured lawns rolled gently toward the cliffs, and the servants moved with practiced discretion. But her husband was not there. Cassius Ashbourne, master of the house and of one of the largest shipping empires in the Northeast, had sent a terse note stating he would join her when business permitted. He did not specify when. He never did. Morgan stood alone in the bright foyer, her gloved hands clasped loosely before her, the faint scent of lavender soap rising from her sleeves. Her summer gown in pale dove blue rustled as she moved, its silk taffeta catching the light like a whisper of moonlit water. There was a weight in her chest, familiar and unwelcome, but she straightened her posture with the grace of a woman who had learned to carry disappointment as though it were part of her attire. She stepped outside to breathe the salted air and remind herself that she still belonged to the world beyond her marriage. The sea wind brushed her cheek, lifting a strand of dark golden hair that had escaped her elegant low chignon. Far below, waves kissed the cliffs with a muted roar, a sound she had always found strangely comforting. It reminded her that beauty and violence existed side by side, just as hope and heartbreak did in a woman's chest. The first gathering of the season came 2 days later, hosted by Eugenia Rathbone, whose name glided through Newport society with equal parts admiration and fear. Eugenia possessed the kind of charm that glittered brighter than diamonds, yet carried an edge sharp enough to draw blood without ever leaving a mark. Morgan arrived alone. Cassius had returned only that morning, offering no explanation for his absence and no warmth in his greeting. His indifference still pressed cold fingers around her heart, but she refused to let them tighten. Eugenia's garden stretched behind her mansion like a floral cathedral, with roses climbing trellises and guests gliding over stone paths as though performing for an invisible audience. Soft music drifted from a string quartet, and the air smelled sweetly of lilies and ambition. Morgan entered quietly, her presence delicate yet dignified, her gown of lavender-grey silk reflecting the pale afternoon sun. She was greeted with polite smiles and shallow compliments, the kind that broke apart like fragile sugar in one's hand. The women noted the absence of her husband with veiled satisfaction, as though confirming a private suspicion. When Eugenia swept forward, all emerald silk and jeweled confidence, her eyes gleamed with something that felt like triumph. "My dear Mrs. Ashbourne," she purred, leaning in as though sharing an intimate confession, "how graceful you look this afternoon. Please come, let me show you your seat." Morgan followed, unaware of the quiet snickers behind gloved hands. The long table glittered beneath the shade of a silk canopy, porcelain plates gleaming like polished shells. Guests were arranged in strategic positions, each placement a social maneuver. Morgan's seat was the last one, at the far end, alone. Cassius sat at the head beside Eugenia, who placed her hand lightly on his sleeve as she laughed at something he had not said. The contrast was deliberate, merciless, and the watching guests knew it. Heat rose behind Morgan's eyes, not anger, not humiliation, but a deep ache, a bruise pressed too many times. She lowered herself into the lonely chair, her posture perfect, her breathing steady. She refused to let the sting of isolation mar her dignity. Cassius did not look at her, not once. The meal passed in a haze of murmurs and glances, each one landing upon her like a snowflake that burned instead of cooled. She felt the silence around her as one feels a chill from a closing door. Yet she kept her gaze steady, offering a faint smile to no one in particular, as though solitude had been her choice all along. Later that afternoon, when she slipped away from the gathering, no one noticed. She walked the cliff path alone, her gloves brushing the stems of wild lavender that grew defiantly between stones. She paused, inhaling the herb's gentle fragrance, feeling something in her chest begin to settle into a calm no one could disturb. By the time she reached her estate, she had made a quiet vow. It was not born of bitterness, nor of anger. It was simply clarity. She would no longer beg for affection that had never been freely given. She removed her gloves with precise movements, feeling the cool air against her fingers. Cassius was nowhere to be found. The thought no longer pierced her the way it once had. She climbed the stairs to her studio, where the scent of paper and pigments grounded her in a world she understood, one she had shaped with her own hands. Her sketchbook lay open on the table, a half-finished drawing of sea lavender waiting for her return. She lifted the bloom she had picked from the cliffs earlier and pressed it gently between the pages. The soft crackle of drying petals felt like a secret she could keep, one that belonged to her alone. The next morning, Morgan walked to the asylum. Annie, small and freckled, ran to her with the unguarded joy of a child who had never been taught to fear rejection. Clara stood just behind her, quieter but no less affectionate. They embraced Morgan as though she were family rather than benefactor, their arms wrapping around her waist with the sincerity the world so often lacked. Here, no one ignored her, no one calculated her value, no one measured her silences. Here, she belonged. As she settled at a wooden table with her sketchbook, sunlight spilling across the page, Morgan felt something shift within her, not a dramatic revelation, but the beginning of a truth she had long feared to face. She could not control whether Cassius ever loved her, but she could choose to love herself again. And on that quiet morning, in a room filled with laughter, pencils, and the hopeful scent of drying lavender, Morgan Ashbourne chose exactly that. Newport awakened beneath a sky the color of pale porcelain, the early summer light casting silver upon the trimmed hedges and winding stone paths that marked the Ashbourne estate. Yet inside the mansion, a quieter world stretched between two people who once shared more words than they did now. What separated Morgan and Cassius that morning was not anger, not even coldness. It was something softer, something more painful. It was absence, the kind that no voice dared to acknowledge. Morgan descended the staircase with calm steps, her dove-grey morning gown flowing around her like a whisper. The fabric shimmered faintly in the early sun that filtered through the tall windows. She carried her sketchbook under one arm, the leather edges worn from use, its presence comforting like the steady pulse of her own heart. She had grown accustomed to beginning her days alone, but today felt different. Today, she felt grounded in herself, rather than suspended in longing. At the bottom of the stairs, she crossed the foyer with the serenity of a woman who had survived disappointment and somehow woven beauty through its threads. The footman stepped forward, bowing slightly. "Breakfast has been set, madam." "Thank you," Morgan replied with a gentle smile, but she did not enter the dining room. Instead, she stepped onto the veranda, where the breeze carried the scent of sea spray and fresh grass. The table set for two was untouched. Cassius had not returned in time for breakfast, nor had she expected him to. She no longer waited for him at every hour like a lantern left burning for a traveler who never arrived. The quiet ache that used to accompany that realization had softened, become manageable, like a faded bruise she no longer pressed. She breathed in the ocean air and let her gaze travel to the cliffs where wildflowers danced in the wind as if they recognized her. She would go to the asylum today. She had sketches to complete and a garden to plan. A small herb plot the children could tend, something fragrant and alive, something tender in a world that had often required her to be stronger than she wished. Morgan walked away from the table without touching a single cup. She felt no need to apologize for her absence, not anymore. Cassius returned to the estate shortly after she departed. His carriage wheels crunched over the gravel drive, the sound sharp and deliberate. He stepped out with his customary precision, his cream linen suit immaculate, his gloves a perfect shade of grey, his gait as steady as the tide. Yet something in his expression faltered when he entered the foyer and learned from a single nod of the butler that Morgan had already left. He paused. It was a brief pause, barely the length of a breath, but it was there. "Morgan is not at home?" he asked, though he knew the answer. "No, sir. She departed for the asylum early this morning." Cassius's jaw tightened. For the first time, he noticed the silence in the house as something unfamiliar. There was no faint hum of Morgan's steps on the second floor, no soft rustle of her skirts passing through the hallway, no delicate floral fragrance lingering in the parlor. He removed his gloves with slow, deliberate movements. "Very well," he murmured, but his voice held an edge of something not yet identifiable, even to himself. Upstairs in her studio, sunlight streamed over Morgan's empty desk. Her sketchbook and pencils were gone. A single chair remained pulled back from the window, a quiet echo of her presence from the night before. Cassius stood at the doorway for a moment longer than he should have. He turned away. At the asylum, Morgan arrived to the chorus of children's laughter, a sound that always disarmed her heart. Annie and Clara ran toward her, their boots clapping lightly against the wooden floorboards. "Miss Morgan," Annie called, her bright face flushed with excitement. "You're earlier than yesterday," Clara observed with a shy smile. Morgan knelt so she could embrace them both, her arms wrapping around them with devotion she rarely showed elsewhere. "I had much to do today," she said. "Shall we begin?" Together they walked into the open courtyard behind the building, where sunlight warmed the soil and a faint breeze rustled through the leaves. Morgan spread her sketches over a small wooden table, the paper weighed down by smooth stones. They leaned over the drawings, wild rosemary, sea lavender, chamomile, thyme, each rendered with delicate precision. "We will plant along that fence," Morgan explained, pointing to a stretch of earth bathed in gentle light. "When the herbs grow, you will help tend them." Annie's eyes widened. "Will the flowers smell like your soap?" Morgan laughed softly. "Perhaps. Or perhaps even better." "Mais?" The children's chatter filled the air, warm and unfiltered. As Morgan knelt to mark the ground with a small trowel, sunlight caught in her hair, warming the golden strands until they glowed like the petals she drew. She felt a quiet contentment settle over her, the kind only found in places untouched by society's cruelty. Hours passed as she sketched the flowers blooming near the courtyard wall, each stroke of her pencil deliberate and tender. Clara sketched beside her, her brow furrowed in determination, while Annie ran back and forth, delivering handfuls of tiny stones she insisted they might need. Morgan smiled at them both. In their company, she felt seen, not judged, needed, not ignored. Later that afternoon she strolled toward the cliffs before returning home. The sea wind brushed her cheek, carrying a note of freedom. She tucked a fresh sprig of sea lavender into her sketchbook, its soft purple petals trembling with each breath of wind. When Morgan returned to the estate, she did not seek out Cassius. She entered quietly, her steps purposeful, her heart steady. Cassius heard the front door close. He was in his study reviewing a stack of ledgers with Mr. Hale, who stood nervously at his side. Mr. Hale, with his thinning grey hair and spectacles perched precariously on his nose, observed his employer carefully. "Sir, I believe there are matters requiring your attention." the advisor said, though his eyes briefly flickered toward the hallway where Morgan had passed moments earlier. Cassius looked up from the ledger. Such as? Mr. Hale hesitated, then spoke with the caution of a man accustomed to walking on thin ice. Such as the impression society is forming about the household. Cassius's expression hardened. I concern myself with business, not gossip. Mr. Hale lowered his gaze. As you wish, sir, but gossip is beginning to concern itself with you. Cassius stilled. The words lingered in the air. He dismissed Mr. Hale with a curt nod, but did not resume reading. Instead, he listened. He listened for her step, for the faint swish of silk, for any sign that Morgan had paused near the study door. He heard nothing. She had gone upstairs without turning toward him, without waiting for him, without leaving even a note requesting a moment of his time, the way she once had, always gentle, always hopeful, and for the first time, the quiet did not feel peaceful. It felt hollow. That evening, the dining room glowed beneath a canopy of crystal chandeliers. Morgan entered gracefully, her pale sage gown fluttering slightly as she moved, her expression serene. A place was set for Cassius, but he was not present. Morgan did not ask where he was. She simply sat, unfolded her napkin, and ate with the composure of a woman who no longer centered her existence around the unpredictable gravity of her husband. Cassius arrived moments after she finished, the door clicking softly behind him. You have already dined, he observed, a faint tension shadowing his words. Yes, Morgan replied, her tone warm but distant. I had an early day. He studied her as she rose from the table, her movements quiet and self-contained. She did not wait to see if he needed anything from her. She offered a polite nod and slipped out of the room, leaving him alone at the head of a table suddenly too long, too polished, too empty. The silence that followed pressed heavily against the high ceiling. Cassius sat slowly, his gaze lingering on the chair she had just vacated. The imprint of her presence was like a ghost, delicate, restrained, and impossible to ignore. He picked up his fork, but did not eat. Something inside him shifted, unsettling, unfamiliar, unwelcome. It was the awareness of losing something he had barely taken the time to hold. In her studio upstairs, Morgan dipped her brush into a cup of clean water. She began a new sketch. Sea lavender swaying along the cliff's edge, its petals trembling in the wind as though holding a secret. She did not know Cassius stood in the hallway outside her door for several long seconds, his hand hovering near the wood, unsure whether he should knock. He did not. He said nothing. And yet, the silence between them had begun to change. Newport greeted the morning with a softness that belied the simmering tensions brewing beneath its polished veneer. Mist clung to the distant cliffs as though unwilling to surrender the night, and the air carried the perfume of dew-damp roses from the manicured gardens lining Bellevue Avenue. The world appeared gentle, serene, expectant. Cassius Ashbourne did not share the sentiment. He stood at the threshold of his carriage, staring at the modest stone building before him. The orphan asylum was unremarkable from the outside, with plain walls and sun-bleached shutters, a place ignored by those who preferred their charity wrapped in silk and announcement. Yet something had compelled him here this morning, something he did not name aloud, a quiet curiosity that had grown in the hollow spaces Morgan had once filled with her waiting. He entered with a composed step, the tap of his polished boots echoing lightly against the wooden floorboards. The air inside was warm, with the scent of freshly baked bread and the dusty sweetness of children's books. A soft hum of voices drifted from down the corridor, small, bright voices that contrasted sharply with the rigid propriety of his own home. Cassius followed the sound. He stopped in the doorway. Morgan sat at a long wooden table, surrounded by children. Their laughter fluttered like ribbons around her, their faces animated with trust and affection. Sunlight filtered through the window and struck her hair, turning the dark gold strands into a halo he had never truly seen before. She wore a soft grey dress, with sleeves rolled delicately at the elbows, her posture relaxed, her expression open, her attention wholly devoted to the two girls beside her, Annie and Clara. She did not see him, and perhaps that was what pierced him first. She did not look up, did not glance toward the door, did not sense him the way she once had. Instead, she leaned close to Clara, gently guiding the girl's hand as she practiced drawing a sprig of chamomile against a worn sheet of paper. "That's it," Morgan whispered tenderly. "Light strokes, like the breath of the wind." Clara nodded, her thin face glowing with pride. Cassius felt something unexpected stir inside him, not anger, not jealousy, but a faint, unsettling ache. He had never seen Morgan like this, not at a ball, not at dinner, not in the quiet hours of their marriage when she used to reach for him, waiting for his gaze to soften. This version of her, alive, vivid, unguarded, was a stranger, a woman he had never taken the time to know. Annie noticed him first and gasped with surprise. "Mr. Ashbourne!" Morgan's hand paused. Slowly she turned. Her expression remained calm, polite. She rose from her seat with measured grace. "Cassius," she said softly, neither pleased nor troubled, merely acknowledging a presence she had not expected. He inclined his head. "I came to observe." It sounded weak, even to his ears. Morgan offered a serene, unreadable smile. "Of course." The children watched with wide eyes, sensing the shift in the air. Cassius approached the table, his gaze drawn to the sketches scattered around Morgan, vibrant illustrations of thyme, chamomile, sea lavender. Each drawing was delicate yet purposeful, marked with confident strokes that betrayed a practiced hand. "You have been busy," he said. "Yes," she replied simply. "The charity journal requested illustrations for their summer issue." He lifted one page, surprised by the initials at the bottom. M.W. "Morgan Whitfield," he murmured aloud. "My maiden name," she said. "It seemed more appropriate for work that is mine alone." He looked at her sharply, but her expression remained serene, almost distant. She did not flinch, did not avert her gaze. He set the drawing down with care. "And the earnings?" he asked. "For school books," she replied, "and food, and paper for them to practice." She gestured toward Annie and Clara, who smiled up at Cassius with shy admiration. The room felt thick with meaning, with things unspoken yet undeniably present. Cassius looked at the children, then at Morgan, and felt a flicker of something like humility. He had known she supported the asylum. He had not known how deeply it sustained her. Cassius watched Morgan kneel beside Annie as the girl tugged at her sleeve, pointing toward a half-finished sketch. Morgan smiled, smoothing the child's hair with a tenderness he had never received, not even once. His breath caught in his chest at the quiet revelation. She has a life without me. The realization struck harder than he expected. She has a world without me, and she does not miss mine. Morgan rose gracefully and approached him. "Would you like to see the garden site?" He nodded, though the answer mattered less than the moment itself. She led him outside, where sunlight warmed the patch of earth she had begun marking with small white stones. Herbs would soon grow here: mint, lemon balm, thyme, plants chosen not for display, but for comfort. "They will tend it themselves," Morgan explained. "Something to nurture, something to guard." Cassius listened, but his thoughts spiraled around the sound of her voice. It was steady, confident, whole. Not a trace of the longing he once recognized in every word she spoke to him. When they returned inside, Morgan brushed dirt from her gloves and offered him a polite, parting smile. "Thank you for visiting." He realized then that she was not asking for him to return, nor did she expect him to. She simply acknowledged him as one acknowledges someone passing through. "Until this evening," Cassius said quietly. "Yes," she replied, with a faint nod that held no anticipation. He left the asylum with a heaviness he did not understand. That evening, Eugenia Rathbone's dinner unfolded beneath chandeliers gleaming like crystalline stars. The room was a golden cage, filled with guests who hid their judgments behind painted fans and small, calculating smiles. The scent of roses mingled with the sharper perfume of intrigue. Morgan entered moments after Cassius, her gown of pale lavender silk falling in gentle folds that made her appear almost ethereal. She wore no jewelry except her simple pearl pendant, yet many turned as she passed, drawn to a quiet dignity that required no embellishment. Eugenia, resplendent in emerald satin, drifted toward Cassius with predatory grace. "Mr. Ashbourne," she murmured, "how fortunate you could join us." Only Cassius inclined his head, polite but distant. His gaze flicked toward Morgan briefly, something softening in his eyes before he shuttered it. Eugenia noticed. She smiled. During dinner, Morgan was placed at the far end of the table, next to a gentleman who spent more time discussing railroads than acknowledging her presence. Cassius sat near Eugenia, who laughed too loudly, leaned too close, and ensured the candlelight caught every jewel at her throat. At first, Cassius endured it. Then he saw it. Morgan's isolation. Not dramatic, not theatrical. Quiet, deliberate. A cruelty disguised as social oversight, or perhaps, because of Eugenia, not disguised at all. Morgan sat with perfect posture, her expression calm, her hands resting lightly in her lap. She did not look at Cassius. She did not seek anyone's attention. She appeared almost serene, but the stillness in her was too controlled to be peace. It was dignity. It was resignation. Cassius's fork paused mid-air. A strange, twisting emotion tightened in his chest. He did not recognize it at first, but it swelled with each passing moment. Each dismissive glance toward Morgan, each smug smile from Eugenia, each empty space left between husband and wife. When Morgan lifted her glass, her eyes briefly met his across the table. The moment was fleeting. Her gaze held no anger, no plea, no hurt, only distance, and the absence of what had once been hope. Cassius abruptly rose from his seat. The entire table stilled. "Eugenia," he said with impeccable politeness, "thank you for the evening, but I find I must leave." He moved toward Morgan, offering a hand she did not take. She simply stood, composed and graceful, her expression unreadable. Gasps rustled through the room like wind brushing silk. Cassius escorted her out, not touching her, not speaking, only matching her pace as though unsure whether he followed her or she allowed him to. Outside, the night air lay cool and silver over Newport. Carriage lamps cast soft halos of light along the road. Cassius inhaled, exhaled, turned toward her. She looked up at him with calm eyes. He opened his mouth to speak, but Morgan offered a small nod, silent and poised, then stepped into the carriage without waiting for his hand. Cassius stood for a moment in the glow of the lantern, feeling the shift inside him like a storm forming beneath tranquil seas. He did not yet understand it. But for the first time, he felt the weight of her absence, even while she stood before him. Morning light swept across the Ashbourne estate like a soft blessing, brushing gold against the tall windows and warming the marble floors. Yet Cassius Ashbourne, master of the house and titan of the shipping world, felt none of the warmth. He stood in the doorway of his study, motionless, as if unwilling to disturb the stillness that had settled over his home. Morgan's presence lingered faintly in the air, a trace of lavender, a memory of silk brushing along the corridor, the ghost of a soft voice that no longer reached for him. The silence was familiar, yet something about it had changed. Before, her quietness had been filled with expectation, like a fragile lantern kept burning in case he might need its light. Now, it was simply quiet, self-contained, entirely her own. Cassius crossed the study with measured steps. His gaze drifted toward the small stack of books on the corner of his desk. They were volumes on botany, pages filled with watercolors of herbs and coastal blooms. He had never noticed them until recently, when Mr. Hale had placed a letter upon his desk with a clipped note from the Charity Journal. Cassius picked up the publication now, its rough-edged pages smelling of ink and salt air. He opened it carefully, his breath catching at the elegant line drawings that adorned the first section. Sea lavender, wild thyme, rosemary blooming along a cliff's edge. Beneath each sketch was a small note written in gentle, precise handwriting. Observations of fragrance, soil, resilience. The initials below each were unmistakable. M.W. Morgan Whitfield, her maiden name, her quiet declaration of ownership. Cassius lowered himself into his chair and began to read. Not skim, not glance. Read. He traced the curve of each stroke with a fingertip, following the delicate shading that turned simple plants into works of art. The accompanying text, short essays in her voice, spoke of survival, of subtle beauty, of things that thrived in harsh coastal winds. He had never noticed the way her words moved, how they carried warmth without sentimentality, how they captured life without demanding attention. He set the journal down slowly. Morgan had crafted entire worlds without him. A faint tug, sharp and unfamiliar, pulled at his chest. Cassius leaned back, the leather of his chair creaking quietly. His gaze drifted to the closed door of the study. He had walked past her studio countless times, assuming it held trivial hobbies. He had never asked why she rose early, or why ink sometimes stained her fingers. He had accepted her presence like one accepts sunlight, pleasant, expected, effortless. Now he knew better. He closed the journal with care and stood abruptly, needing movement, needing air. He left the study and walked through the estate with measured strides, noting the minute details he had ignored before, the dullness of the silver tray on the console, the wilted roses in a vase Morgan had once tended herself, the absence of laughter from servants who had once felt comfortable in these halls. He saw everything with new eyes. That same morning, a young maid, no more than 17, hurried past with downcast eyes. Her apron was wrinkled, her hands trembling slightly. "You!" Cassius called. She froze. He approached her, noticing the patch of red on her wrist, as if she had been scrubbing floors without gloves. "What is your name?" he asked, but gently. "Louisa, sir. Who dismissed you last week?" Her eyes widened. I was not dismissed, sir. I was only reduced in hours. Mrs. Partridge said the household needed tightening. Cassius's jaw tightened. Mrs. Partridge, their housekeeper, had become increasingly rigid in her attempts to impress Eugenia Rathbone. He inhaled slowly. "Your hours are restored," he said. "With a small increase." Louisa gasped. "Sir, thank you. And gloves," he added, glancing at her wrist. "You will receive proper gloves for cleaning, no exceptions." Tears brightened her eyes. She curtsied and fled before they spilled. Cassius exhaled a breath that trembled more than he wished to admit. He moved through the household with a purpose that surprised even him. A footman he had never noticed carried a limp in his left leg, immediately granted lighter duties. A cook's assistant confessed quietly that she'd been punished for burning a loaf of bread. Cassius dismissed the punishment and sent her to rest. By the time midday arrived, the mansion felt subtly different, softer, warmer. Yet the door that remained closed, the only one untouched, was Morgan's studio. Cassius walked past it once, twice, a third time, though he did not touch the handle. He found himself drawn to the veranda instead, where he stood with his hands behind his back, watching the waves crash against the cliffs. He felt the pull of something he did not yet have the courage to name. Later that afternoon, he made his way to the docks, where the smell of tar and salt mingled with the cries of workers hauling crates from bobbing ships. A young dock worker stumbled as he lifted a heavy barrel, his face pale with exhaustion. Cassius stepped forward instinctively. "Leave that," he said sharply. The worker blinked in shock. "Sir?" Cassius pressed several coins into his hand. "For new boots," he murmured, "and rest. You will not return tomorrow." "But, sir, my family—" Cassius shook his head. "Rest." The worker's gratitude was fierce, immediate, and more sincere than any praise Cassius had received in years. He walked away before anyone could see the sudden heaviness in his eyes. When he returned home near dusk, a carriage waited outside the gate. Eugenia's. She stood beside it, her emerald gown gleaming like polished malice. "Cassius," she called with a coy smile, "I hope you have not forgotten my supper invitation this evening." He stared at her with cold clarity. "I declined," he said. She laughed lightly. "You must not have meant it. Everyone expects you." "I will not be attending," he repeated, voice sharp enough to pierce silk. Eugenia's smile faltered. Cassius walked past her without another word. Inside, he paused outside Morgan's studio door again. A faint glow seeped beneath the frame. He lifted a hand, fingers inches from the wood, but lowered it slowly. He was not ready, not yet, to face the quiet he had allowed to stretch so wide between them. He walked away. In the solitude of her studio, Morgan sat with her hair loosely pinned, a few golden strands falling near her cheek. The sunset bathed her in soft amber light as she sketched the fragile outline of a sea lavender bloom. She did not hear Cassius approach the first time, or the second, but she noticed something else moments later. On her table, resting atop her open sketchbook, lay a single fresh blossom, sea lavender. Her breath caught gently in her throat. She lifted it with careful fingers, turning it slowly between her hands. Its scent was faint, but unmistakably tied to the cliffs she loved, and somehow now to him. She pressed the bloom between the pages of her sketchbook without hesitation. Downstairs, Cassius stood in the shadowed corridor, knowing only that he had done something instinctive and reckless and utterly unlike himself. That night, neither spoke of the lavender. Neither spoke at all, yet the gesture hung in the silence like a suspended breath. At the asylum the next afternoon, Morgan found Clara sitting beside a younger girl who struggled to read. The younger child's brow was knit in frustration, her small fingers gripping a book with too tight a hold. Clara scooted closer, touching the girl's shoulder. "Here," she murmured gently. "Let me show you. Slowly. See? Like this." Morgan stood at a distance, her heart swelling with quiet pride. Clara's voice was steady, her manner patient, her confidence blooming like a flower watered with kindness. Morgan felt something soft and luminous unfold inside her. Her influence was taking root. Her life, her real life, was growing beyond the boundaries of marriage, beyond silence, beyond waiting. And far away, on the cliffs where the wind whispered through the sea lavender, the tide shifted with a force neither she nor Cassius yet understood. The night of Eugenia Rathbone's ball arrived draped in opulence. Newport society had not witnessed such extravagance in years, and the anticipation fluttered through parlors and drawing rooms like embroidered fans in restless hands. It was said that Eugenia had imported crystal chandeliers from Paris, had roses shipped from Belgium, had commissioned a string quartet from New York to play only Chopin and Strauss. It was not a celebration. It was a performance, and everyone knew who the audience was meant to be. The Ashbournes arrived later than expected. Their carriage rolled up the gravel drive in dignified silence, the polished black lacquer reflecting the golden light of the grand mansion that loomed like a cathedral of vanity. Cassius stepped out first, dressed in black tailcoat and white cravat, his expression unreadable, his presence commanding. Behind him, Morgan emerged in a gown of midnight blue silk, the fabric glimmering like moonlight over still water. The bodice was modest, her shoulders covered with a sheer overlay embroidered with silver thread, her only jewelry a pair of small pearl earrings and her wedding ring. The hush that fell when they entered was not from admiration alone, it was calculation. Eyes tracked their movements like birds of prey. The ballroom was a vision of porcelain elegance. Tall columns framed the space, each draped in sheer gauze that shimmered with candlelight. Tables were adorned with towering arrangements of white orchids and gold candelabras, while waiters moved like shadows through the throng. The guests stood in glittering clusters, smiles stretched too wide, laughter pitched too high. And at the center of it all stood Eugenia, adorned in emerald silk that clung to her like ivy. Her hair was twisted into a crown of elaborate coils, her neck heavy with layered gemstones. She greeted her guests with kisses just shy of warmth, her gaze constantly scanning for the cue she had long been planning. When she saw Morgan, she did not approach immediately. She let the tension steep. Morgan's hand rested lightly at her waist as she moved through the crowd. She spoke little, nodded politely, and took no champagne from the trays offered. Cassius remained beside her, attentive but silent, offering neither affection nor distance. It was the first time in weeks they had arrived together, and not alone. Eugenia circled like a dancer preparing for her solo. At the center of the room stood a table cloaked in ivory lace, and upon it rested a single-bound ledger, closed, inconspicuous, as if awaiting nothing in particular until it was time. A hush rippled through the room, subtle at first, then unmistakable. Eugenia stepped into the center of the gathering, her voice rising with just enough projection to catch interest, without appearing rehearsed. "How delightful," she began, "that tonight we celebrate not only beauty and art, but integrity." She smiled, turning slightly toward Cassius, "particularly in business." The guests chuckled politely. "And yet," she continued, her fingers trailing along the spine of the ledger, "it seems not all acts of charity are as selfless as they appear." Morgan stiffened. Cassius narrowed his eyes. Eugenia opened the ledger. "I hesitate to speak ill of any woman, particularly one so admired." Her tone was a blade wrapped in velvet. "But I do believe the public has a right to transparency, especially when the generous funds of Ashbourne Holdings are concerned." She lifted the ledger slightly, displaying rows of inked numbers and transactions, carefully crafted lies. "Records suggest," she said sweetly, "that charitable funds meant for infrastructure were funneled instead into art supplies, paper, flowers, sketching tools, a garden." She turned her gaze slowly toward Morgan. How quaint. The silence that followed was sharp, electric. Morgan did not speak. Cassius took one slow step forward, then another. The crowd parted as if moved by a tide, unsure whether to recoil or bear witness. Cassius reached the table, took the ledger from Eugenia's hands, and turned a few pages. His jaw remained set, his eyes unreadable. When he looked up, his voice was calm, but it carried like thunder. "I reviewed these accounts 3 weeks ago." Eugenia blinked. Cassius turned the ledger toward the guests. "This is a forgery." Gasps echoed through the room. "The original books remain with my accountant. These figures," he continued, lifting one page, "are fabricated by someone with just enough knowledge to attempt credibility, but not enough to understand how I protect what bears my name." He paused, and then, with the measured confidence of a man not given to performance, he turned to Morgan. "My wife's work with the asylum has been the only investment I've made without regret." Morgan's breath caught. The crowd stood frozen in a tableau of astonishment. Cassius closed the ledger and handed it to a nearby footman. "This will be turned over to the authorities. If anyone has questions, I suggest they ask them directly. Of me." He turned to Eugenia, who stood pale despite the emerald gown that suddenly looked more garish than regal. "If you meant this as an entertainment," Cassius said softly, "you have sorely misunderstood your audience." Then, without another glance at the room, he offered his arm to Morgan. And for the first time in years, she took it. They walked out together. No music resumed, no laughter followed. The evening had ended before the second course. In the carriage, silence reigned at first. The clip-clop of hooves, the rattle of the wheels, the coolness of night air through a barely open window. Cassius sat beside her, but did not speak. Morgan looked down at her gloved hands, resting in her lap, still and calm. When she finally turned to him, her voice was quiet, not cold. "Why did you defend me?" He looked at her, his expression no longer hard but vulnerable. "Because I should have long before tonight." Her throat tightened, her breath catching behind it. She turned her gaze to the window, watching the lantern lights blur into streaks as they passed. "I feared," she whispered, "that if I lost myself entirely, you wouldn't notice, that I could disappear in the space beside you and you would never feel the absence." Cassius did not answer immediately, but when he spoke, his voice was stripped of armor. "I noticed." The words hung in the air like a confession. "I didn't know who you were, Morgan," he continued. "Not truly. I thought silence meant peace. I thought restraint was the same as strength. But I see now, silence can be a kind of cruelty, and I was too proud to question it." Her eyes glistened, but she did not look away. "I used to wait for you to see me," she said. "Then I stopped waiting. I became someone else." Cassius nodded slowly. "And now I must learn to see who that someone is." The carriage turned into the estate path, the mansion glowing softly ahead, its windows golden and quiet. Cassius offered his hand as they stepped down, but said nothing more. Inside, the house greeted them with stillness. Morgan paused at the foot of the staircase. He did not follow her. She looked back once, and in that fleeting moment, their eyes met. No longer strangers, but not yet allies. Two people, newly aware of each other, not with passion, not yet with tenderness, but with possibility. She ascended the stairs without a word, and he watched her go, realizing for the first time that to walk beside her he would have to become more than a man of industry and ice. He would have to become something human, something real. And Morgan, no longer waiting, had already begun to lead the way. The summer ripened with a quiet intensity that echoed the tension woven into the days at the Ashbourne estate. Newport bloomed with its usual displays of wealth. Garden fetes, boat parades, whispered invitations penned on imported parchment. But beneath the silk and surface shimmer, society held its breath. Something had shifted, something subtle, but undeniable. The Ashbournes were no longer invisible. It was not a scandal, nor a declaration. It was something more delicate, a change in posture. A moment of contact, a conversation held not out of duty, but out of desire to understand. And as with all things in Newport, eyes followed not with kindness, but with hunger. Morgan moved through this new gaze with grace. She had learned long ago not to bow before scrutiny. Her daily visits to the asylum continued uninterrupted. Her hands remained ink-stained from sketching, her gloves lightly scented with rosemary and earth. She had begun collecting the children's drawings and pinning them in her studio, not for display, but for memory. She did not ask whether Cassius noticed her absences. She did not expect him to. But one morning he was waiting at the door. He stood beside the carriage with gloved hands folded, his expression unreadable, his posture still and composed. "I'd like to accompany you," he said. Morgan blinked. "To the asylum." His nod was quiet. "If you'll allow it." The words were strange on his tongue, gentle, unfamiliar. Morgan regarded him for a long moment before stepping into the carriage without a word. It was not a refusal. Cassius joined her in silence. The ride was brief, but full of unspoken things. The clatter of hooves over stone, the salt-tinged wind through the open window, the scent of sea and lavender settling between them like a third presence. They did not speak, but Morgan did not turn away. At the asylum, the children's laughter welcomed them like morning bells. Annie, barefoot and freckled, ran to Morgan's side, stopping short when she saw the tall figure beside her. "Is he really your husband?" she whispered, loud enough for Cassius to hear. Morgan smiled faintly. "Yes, darling." Cassius lowered himself slightly, his movements stiff but not cold. "And you must be Annie." She nodded solemnly. "I planted the thyme by the fence. It's growing." Cassius gave a small bow. "Then you've done better than many gardeners I've paid handsomely." Annie blushed scarlet and ran off giggling. Morgan turned toward the herb garden with a sigh of amusement. "Come, there's work to be done." The seawall, a low stone barrier separating the garden from the encroaching cliffside, had weathered too many storms. Morgan had petitioned for reinforcement weeks earlier, but received no funds. Now, without explanation, the mason and his apprentice stood ready, hired quietly the evening before. Cassius removed his gloves and coat. Morgan stared. "You don't need to." "I want to," he said simply. He stepped into the garden, rolled up his sleeves, and lifted the first stone. What followed was not miraculous. It was work, dirty, honest work, the kind that turned Cassius's white linen shirt grey with sweat, that stained his hands and soaked his collar. Morgan watched from the shaded archway as he knelt beside Annie, who guided him in, patting down the earth around the newest lavender cutting. "You must be gentle," she instructed, her tiny hands brushing soil over roots. "They don't like to be rushed." Cassius nodded. "Neither do people." Morgan looked away, her throat tightening. Her fingers traced the edge of her sketchbook, but she did not lift her pencil. She simply watched. Later, Clara sat beneath a maple tree with two younger girls, showing them how to shade petals with soft strokes of charcoal. Her voice was steady, patient. The younger children followed her with wide, admiring eyes. Morgan's gaze lingered there as well, marveling not at what she had taught, but at how the girls had become teachers themselves. That afternoon, as Cassius wiped sweat from his brow and accepted a cup of water from a delighted Annie, he caught Morgan's gaze across the garden. She did not smile, but she did not look away. That evening, a journalist came to call. Morgan had not expected him. He arrived with a notebook and the peculiar softness of a man who had seen more truth than he could ever print. His interest was genuine, curious not about scandals, but about her sketches, her work with the girls, the garden behind the asylum wall. "I'd like to write about you," he said quietly. "Not as Mrs. Ashbourne, as Morgan." She hesitated. "Why?" "Because women like you are rarely seen, and when they are, it's always through someone else's gaze." Morgan did not answer immediately. She thought of sea lavender, of quiet fire, of standing beside a man who had once made her feel invisible. "Very well," she said, "but I'll speak plainly." The interview took place the following day beneath the arbor, her sketchbook open on the table between them, her voice clear and even. She spoke not of parties or fashion or marriage. She spoke of soil and salt air, of Clara and Annie, of women who had no titles, but who held the world together with ink-stained fingers and unbroken backs. The article was published a week later. The headline read, "The Quiet Garden at the Edge of the Sea. Morgan Ashbourne, and the work that grows without applause." It spread faster than she expected. Ladies read it in drawing rooms. Gentlemen murmured over it at club breakfasts. Servants passed it hand to hand behind kitchen doors. Morgan said nothing. She kept the copy folded beneath her sketchbook. Cassius read it alone, in his study at midnight. He read it twice, and again, the next morning. At the club, the whispers began to change, not about Morgan, but about him. About the man who had once scoffed at philanthropic fancies, but now spent afternoons hauling stones and kneeling in dirt. Some admired, some sneered, some watched with wary fascination. One of them was Harold Denton, a powerful investor, calculating and cruel, with fingers dug deep into the Ashbourne shipping empire. He sat with Eugenia at her private breakfast salon, sipping bitter coffee and listening. "She's dangerous," Eugenia murmured, her emerald ring catching the light. "She's not foolish," he replied. "She doesn't have to be. She only has to make him foolish." Eugenia leaned forward. "You can stop this. Threaten to pull out unless he cuts her loose, publicly." Denton considered. "I don't need her gone," he said. "I need him scared." That afternoon, a letter arrived for Cassius, hand-delivered by a club porter. It was brief, signed in bold ink. "Withdraw from the asylum board or the Denton shipping contract will dissolve." He read it once, then folded it without flinching. That night, Morgan stood at her studio window, watching the garden below fade into dusk. Cassius entered without knocking, but quietly. She turned slowly. "Is something wrong?" He crossed the room, stopping just before her. "I lost a contract today." She blinked, lips parting. He continued, voice steady. "They asked me to choose between a fortune and your name." Morgan waited, heart thundering. "I didn't hesitate," he said, "not because I'm noble, but because I finally know what matters." She said nothing. Not at first. Then, softly, "And what is that?" Cassius lifted his hand, not to touch her, but to offer her something. The folded article. "The one about her. I kept it," he whispered. "Not because it's about you, because it's yours." Morgan reached for the paper, her fingertips grazing his, and though neither moved closer, neither looked away. Outside, the sea wind stirred the lavender. Inside, something unnamed rooted deeper in the space between them. The morning sky over Newport was pale and unspeaking, the kind of fragile blue that offered no promises. Along the coast, the tide rolled in heavier than usual, crashing with steady determination against the jagged rocks beneath the Ashbourne estate. It was the kind of day when things were revealed, not with thunder, but with quiet, irreversible shifts. Cassius stood at the head of the long mahogany table in his private study, a folded letter clutched tightly in one hand. Mr. Hale lingered nearby, spectacles perched precariously on the bridge of his nose, fingers nervously drumming against a closed ledger. "They've pulled the Denton contract," Cassius said finally, his voice low but unmistakably clear. Mr. Hale exhaled slowly. "Sir, that accounts for nearly 1/3 of the eastern port shipments." "I'm aware," Cassius replied. "They'll expect a response. They'll push harder now. They believe you've softened." Cassius looked up sharply. "Because I refuse to sacrifice my wife's name for the convenience of cowards." The advisor flinched. "Because they see you choosing principle over profit. That makes them nervous." Cassius turned toward the tall window, where sunlight filtered through lace curtains and painted soft patterns on the floor. Below, the sea moved in restless blue, and somewhere along the path to the cliffs, Morgan was likely walking, her sketchbook tucked under her arm, her steps steady and silent. He spoke again, more to the room than to the man. "Let them be nervous." Mr. Hale hesitated. "There will be consequences. I welcome them," and he meant it. For the first time in years, Cassius Ashbourne did not measure his decisions in gold. He measured them in worth. By the time the house settled into its late morning rhythm, Morgan was seated in the garden with her sketchbook open on her lap. The children of the asylum gathered around her in quiet delight. The sea wind teased at the edges of her paper as she drew, one hand steady, the other resting gently on the table. A figure approached from the gravel path. It was the young journalist from Boston, his hat respectfully tucked beneath his arm, his notebook held close to his chest. "Mrs. Ashbourne," he greeted, his tone tentative. Morgan looked up. Her expression, serene but attentive, softened slightly when she recognized him. "Mr. Beckett, would you still allow the interview?" he asked. "After what happened?" She closed her sketchbook and stood, brushing a lock of hair from her cheek. "Especially after what happened." They sat beneath the arbor while the girls played nearby. The garden rustled with wind and innocence, and Morgan's voice flowed like the water she so often drew. Gentle, clear, persistent. She spoke not of reputations or betrayals. She spoke of the value of nurturing something without reward, of planting seeds in rocky soil, of finding dignity in silence, of choosing beauty not as luxury, but as defiance. When the article appeared 2 days later in both the Newport Herald and the Boston Morning Clarion, it did not bear her husband's name. It did not mention Ashbourne Holdings. It did not allude to social rank or inherited privilege. It simply read, "The Botanist of the Cliffs." The piece was quiet, like her, but it shook the city. Women clipped it from the pages and tucked it into journals. Schoolgirls whispered about it between lessons. Old men in dark suits frowned behind newspapers and read it twice. Cassius found the article on his desk the following morning. No one had left it there. No note accompanied it. But he knew who had placed it. He read each word slowly, his heart caught between astonishment and something quieter, something resembling reverence. She had told the world who she was, not as a wife, not as a name, as a voice, and she had done it without asking permission. That evening, the sun dipped low behind the hills, setting the estate in hues of gold and lavender. The corridors were empty. The house breathed with the hush of twilight. Cassius climbed the stairs with careful steps and paused before Morgan's studio. The door was slightly ajar. A thread of lamplight spilled into the hallway. He knocked once. "Come in," she said softly. He entered. Morgan sat at her desk, her back to the window, her shoulders lit by the amber glow of the oil lamp. Her hair was pulled back in its usual braid, a few strands curling against her cheek from the sea air. Her dress was simple, cream with pale blue embroidery at the cuffs. Her hands rested lightly on the desk, as if she had known he would come. Cassius did not speak right away. He simply looked at her, not the way he used to, from a distance marked by silence and assumption, but closely, carefully, as one looks upon a person they are finally willing to see. "I read your interview," he said. She nodded, her gaze calm. "It was beautiful," he added. "Thank you." He stepped forward, the silence between them as fragile as lace. "If you weren't already my wife," he said slowly, "if I were a stranger meeting you tonight for the first time, standing in a ballroom, across a room of voices and light, would you let me court you?" Her breath caught, the moment suspended between them. He did not move closer. He waited. Morgan stood from her chair, her heartbeat an ache in her throat. She turned to the shelf where her sketchbooks were lined in neat rows. From between the pages of the most recent, she retrieved something pressed and delicate. She walked back to him and placed it in his hand, a fresh blossom of sea lavender. Its scent was faint but present like memory. She looked up at him, her eyes glistening, not with tears but with quiet knowing. "Begin," she whispered. Cassius closed his fingers around the flower, as if it was something sacred. He did not kiss her. He did not touch her hand, but he looked at her, truly looked, and in that gaze was the beginning of everything she had once stopped hoping for. In the distance, the sea thundered against the cliffs. The wind stirred through the garden, and the house, so long a place of performance and distance, began to hum with something new, something real. The edge of the cliff was no longer a place of falling, it was a place of choosing. The Ashbourne estate had always been a portrait of order, silent hallways, polished woodwork, the distant ticking of imported clocks measuring out days that never touched the soul. But in the weeks that followed the interview and the sea lavender in Cassius's hand, something subtle changed within those walls. The stillness softened. The corners no longer echoed with cold, but held warmth, as if the house itself were beginning to breathe again. It began in the smallest ways. At breakfast, Cassius now arrived on time, not because punctuality mattered, but because she was there. Morgan would already be seated, her tea cooling beside a plate she often forgot to touch, lost in the pages of a novel or a sketch still forming in her mind. He didn't interrupt her. He poured his own coffee in silence and waited until she looked up, not expectantly but gently, and offered him a nod that held no resentment, only quiet awareness. Their conversations were brief at first. Fragments of thought, questions about the garden, mentions of Clara's progress or Annie's stubbornness. But slowly, like seeds pressed into soil and left to bloom, those words became something more. One afternoon, Cassius entered his study to find 3 small canvases resting against the wall, wild roses, painted in oil and soft watercolor, blooming in layers of dusty pink and ivory, their petals loose and windswept. He touched the edge of the frame and turned, finding Morgan standing in the doorway, a trace of color on her cheeks. "I thought you might want them here," she said. "I do," he replied, and meant it. He hung them himself that evening, lining them above the fireplace where once hung a map of the Ashbourne shipping routes. When Mr. Hale entered the next morning and saw the change, he paused, but said nothing. Cassius joined Morgan at the asylum twice that week. Not for appearances, nor for redemption. He arrived quietly, in plain sleeves rolled past his wrists, and worked beside the gardener to rebuild a wooden trellis for the climbing jasmine vines. He didn't speak much. He didn't need to. The children had begun to greet him with the shy confidence usually reserved for uncles or older brothers. Annie tugged on his sleeve to show him how her time had sprouted. Clara placed a charcoal drawing on his lap, a portrait of a lavender field that stretched further than the eye could see. He took it home and placed it in a silver frame on his desk. That evening, Morgan found it there, her fingers hovering over the glass. She said nothing, neither did he. Instead, he folded a small note and tucked it into the rim of her teacup the next morning. "You've made this house feel lived in." She didn't respond with words. But that evening, when she poured his tea, she placed beside it a note of her own. "And you've made it feel like mine." The closeness between them was not loud. It was not adorned with declarations or grand gestures. It lived in glances, in shared silence, in the way Cassius now paused before opening her studio door, or the way Morgan tilted her face when she heard his footsteps down the hall. They did not touch. But they began to exist in each other's presence fully, without fear of interruption. And that, Morgan thought, was its own kind of intimacy. But the world beyond their gates had not softened. It had only grown more curious. And envy, as always, breeds poison. One morning, as Morgan arrived at the asylum, she was met not by the usual joy of children's laughter, but by the tight-lipped presence of 3 members of the board seated stiffly in the director's office. They did not rise when she entered. "Mrs. Ashbourne," one of them began, adjusting the collar of his waistcoat with a cough, "we regret to bring this to your attention, but certain matters have been raised." Morgan's hands remained folded at her waist, her voice calm. "What matters?" "There are rumors," another said, avoiding her gaze, "concerning your birth, that your mother was not married, that you were not born under legitimate circumstances." Morgan's face did not change. She did not flinch. She had heard the whispers before, years ago, always in hushed tones behind church pews or in the corners of ballrooms, but they had never mattered. Not until someone had chosen to turn them into a weapon. The first board member continued. "While we do not take these claims as truth, of course, the asylum's reputation must be preserved. Donors are sensitive. So you'd like me to step down?" Morgan said evenly. They nodded in near unison. She straightened her spine. "And if I refuse?" The director cleared his throat awkwardly. "It will not be a dismissal. It would be a quiet departure. A necessary one." Morgan's hands trembled, but only slightly. Enough for her to notice. Enough for her to gather every ounce of the steel she had buried beneath silk. Before she could respond, the door opened. Cassius stepped inside. He was not expected, but he did not falter. His eyes swept the room, registering the 3 men seated at the table, the way they looked at his wife, as if she were a name on a ledger rather than a woman who had transformed the lives of dozens. He did not greet them. He looked only at Morgan. "Is this true?" he asked softly. "That they believe it?" she replied. "Yes." He turned to the board. "If you no longer want my wife's guidance here, I'll take my name, my money, and my support elsewhere. And I'll build an institution twice as large just beyond these gates, and I will name it for her, and I will make certain that no one forgets why." The men paled. Cassius stepped closer, his voice now quiet but immovable. "Morgan Ashbourne is not a scandal to be managed. She is the reason this place breathes." The silence that followed was more powerful than any argument. One of the men stood. "There is no need for such measures. Perhaps we were premature." Cassius nodded once. Morgan said nothing, but her eyes glistened, not with weakness, but with something stronger than victory. Recognition. Later, as they walked the garden path side by side, neither spoke. The air was heavy with summer, thick with the scent of rosemary and chamomile. The sea pulsed in the distance, steady as breath. Cassius finally broke the silence. "I didn't know." She shook her head. "It doesn't matter." He stopped walking. "It does to me." Morgan turned toward him, the fading light painting her face in gold and shadow. "Why?" "Because I spent so long looking past you. And now, all I see is you." She swallowed hard, her lips parting as if to speak, but no words came. He didn't reach for her. He simply stepped closer, and in the space between them, filled with wind and memory and things not yet spoken, they stood still, listening to the house behind them breathe, not as strangers, not yet as lovers, but as something new, something fragile, something true. The wind that swept across the Newport cliffs in early September carried more than salt and sea. It carried the murmurs of a society unsettled. Something was shifting, not just in the air, but in the conversations that fluttered behind lace fans and within the smoky dens of gentlemen's clubs. The name Ashbourne, once synonymous with cold calculation and commerce, now danced on tongues with something dangerously close to reverence or suspicion. Cassius had done the unthinkable. The news spread like fire. He had resigned from not one, but two of his most profitable ventures. Enterprises that had for decades thrived on silence and shadow, on underpaid labor, exploitative shipping contracts, and elegant partnerships with morally bankrupt men. He had stood before the board of Holloway and Crestwell, his voice steady as he named their dealings what they were: predatory. And then he walked away. No theatrics, no press conference. Just the truth, spoken with the same cold precision that had once built his empire. When asked why, he said only, "Because I can no longer pretend not to see." The world reeled. Investors threatened. Allies abandoned him. The Times called him unstable. But in the streets by the docks, someone painted his name in blue across the side of a tenement wall. A strange benediction. Ashbourne stood down. And in the Ashbourne household, the change was quieter, but no less seismic. Cassius had sold a parcel of land near the rail lines, long coveted by industrial developers, and donated the full sum to construct dignified housing for dock workers and their families. He refused to attach his name to the project. The deed was transferred anonymously, though the truth would never stay hidden for long. Word traveled. Eyes turned. Morgan watched it all unfold from the edges of parlors and pages. She had expected resistance, hesitation, or regret. Instead, she saw clarity in him, not a man lost, but one found, inch by inch, through 1,000 small undoings. At the asylum, the children now referred to Cassius without fear. Clara, once so wary, had taken to greeting him with a lifted chin and careful smile, always protective of the younger girls. She now led reading groups beneath the arbor, correcting softly, praising sparingly. Annie, ever restless, taught the littlest ones how to draw daisies and dandelions with charcoal nubs. Their laughter mingled with the scent of lavender that clung to the wind, and Morgan sometimes stood in the shadows of the corridor, just to listen. One afternoon, Mr. Hale approached her with uncharacteristic hesitation. He had never been one for sentiment. "You should know," he said, adjusting his cufflink as if to distract himself. "He dismissed 3 men this week for attempting to undercut wages. All of them men he once dined with." Morgan nodded, folding her hands. "I suspected." May he looked at her then, not with the neutrality of a manservant or the politeness of an associate, but with something bordering on awe. "You changed more than a man, Mrs. Ashbourne. You changed the future of this house." She said nothing, but the words hung in the air like lanterns, left burning past dawn. That evening, invitations arrived for a quiet garden fête, hosted by the Everleigh family, known for their discretion and love of twilight gatherings. Cassius accepted for them both, without asking. When Morgan raised an eyebrow, he only replied, "If I may walk beside you, I will go anywhere." The garden behind the Everleigh estate was walled in ivy and lit by gas lamps shaped like lilacs. The string quartet played without flourish, and the guests, a smaller, braver circle of Newport society, sipped brandy instead of champagne. Here, no one whispered when the Ashbournes arrived. They simply watched. Cassius stayed at Morgan's side. Not possessively, not ostentatiously, but with a presence that was unmistakable. He spoke only when spoken to. He watched her, not as a man guarding his reputation, but as one witnessing a constellation he had once overlooked. Later, as the music softened and the guests thinned, Morgan found herself beneath a silver birch near the back hedge, its leaves trembling in the breeze. She traced the rim of her glass, thinking of wild roses and silent galleries. "May I?" Cassius asked. She turned. He stood a few paces away, not touching her, not presuming. "I was hoping," he said, voice low, "that you might allow me to court you." She blinked. "We are already married," he nodded. "But I was hoping to begin again, in full. Dances, letters, poetry, or silence, if that is your preference, whatever you ask." Morgan looked at him, really looked, at the man who had once arrived late to parties she dreaded, who had built empires on the backs of strangers and called it order. The man who now stood before her like a question. She placed her glass on the stone ledge beside them. "No performance," she said. He stilled. "Just stay." A single breath escaped him, something like relief, something like wonder. "I will," he said. They did not dance that night. They walked home in silence, hands brushing but not quite meeting, and behind them the sea lavender bloomed, unnoticed by all but the stars. It was the first day of October, and the wind that rolled in from the Atlantic was crisp with memory. The Ashbourne home, once a fortress of silence and polished appearances, had become something altogether different. Laughter rose from the garden in bursts. Music echoed faintly through open windows. Servants no longer averted their eyes in the halls. And the doors, always once closed, remained ajar. 1 year had passed since the fete beneath the silver birch. 12 full months of rewoven habits, unfamiliar joys, and halting human repair. And now, in the salon once reserved only for business or masculine debate, Morgan hosted a gathering of minds unlike any Newport had seen. A sculptor from Providence debated a suffragette from Albany. A Quaker schoolteacher argued gently with a steel heiress about ethics in philanthropy. Clara, in a pale blue dress sewn by the girls of the asylum, poured tea without spilling a drop. She paused every so often to correct Annie's grammar, who sat on the rug sketching a cat that looked suspiciously like a fox. Morgan moved among them not as a hostess, but as a woman in her element. The house bore her imprint now, in the wild rose paintings that hung in Cassius's study, in the scent of crushed lavender steeped into the linens, in the small wooden sign that hung discreetly above the east corridor, "Ashbourne House, every soul has worth." She had refused to name the new wing of the asylum after herself, despite many insisting. "Let it be nameless," she had said, her voice firm. "Let it belong to those who need it." And still, people knew. Her botanical sketches, once signed only with her maiden initials, now hung in a Boston gallery under her full name, Morgan Isabel Ashbourne. The critics called her work precise and tender, and a columnist wrote, "One sees in her florals a soul accustomed to silence, but no longer bound by it." Cassius had read that sentence aloud at breakfast, then folded the paper with care. He said nothing, but he held her hand for the rest of the meal. His own transformation had not gone unnoticed either. There were those who still called him mad for walking away from wealth, for turning his back on entrenched power. But there were more who looked to him now with a different kind of awe, not fear, but something bordering on reverence. He had not disappeared from society. He had simply ceased to perform for it. Eugenia Rathbone, once the unchallenged star of every season, had left quietly for Europe in early spring. No grand farewell, no final gala. Some said she had suffered scandal, others whispered debts, but in truth no one truly cared. Her absence left no wound, only space. On the morning of their wedding anniversary, a date neither had previously marked, Cassius invited Morgan for a walk along the cliffs. They walked in silence for some time, the waves crashing below, gulls wheeling above them in lazy spirals. The path was narrow and edged in autumn-blushed grass. Morgan wore a soft grey shawl, the one she had woven herself during the winter evenings while the fireplace crackled and Clara read aloud from Emerson. They stopped where the path bent into a crescent, overlooking a jagged drop to the rocks below. The place where, once, she had sketched alone, pressing the stem of a sea lavender between the pages of her journal and wondering how long she could endure a life half-lived. Cassius turned to her. "You stopped begging," he said, his voice roughened by wind and time. Morgan looked at him, her expression unreadable. He continued, "And I started becoming." There was no performance in the words, no grand gesture, only truth. She took his hand, not with desperation, not with plea, with choice. They stood together, facing the sea that had witnessed the undoing and reweaving of their marriage. Her fingers curled around his with the quiet steadiness of roots, of something that had grown slow and deep and real. Below them, the sea lavender bloomed again, fragile and defiant. A flower no one planted. A flower that returned each year, even after being forgotten. Like love that no longer needed to be begged for, only recognized. The garden bloomed differently now. It was no longer just lavender and wild roses. Tulips, peonies, and sweet pea vines crept across the trellises Cassius had built by hand, crooked but sturdy. 2 small pairs of boots lay abandoned by the fountain, each caked in mud and grass stains. Somewhere in the distance, laughter echoed, the deep, uncontained laughter of children. Morgan sat on the bench beneath the birch tree, her sketchbook resting on her knees, though she hadn't turned a page in half an hour. Her daughter, Eleanor, named after no one in particular, but loved as if she bore every ancestral hope, had just turned 6. Her son, Julian, 2 years younger and insatiably curious, had recently decided the garden belonged to him and no one else. "He's dug up your daffodils again," Cassius said behind her, his voice gentler now than it had ever been in those first years. Morgan smiled without looking up. "He says they needed rescuing." Cassius sat beside her, careful not to disturb the growing belly beneath her bodice. "And what of their mother?" "She needs nothing," Morgan said, tilting her head toward the sunlight, "except this." They watched their children chase each other through the orchard. Eleanor paused, mid-sprint, to hand a tiny blossom to Julian. He looked at it as if it were treasure. The world had changed. The asylum's nameless wing had inspired 3 others across the state. Morgan's name had appeared in 2 more galleries and 1 scientific journal, a feat that once would have been impossible for a woman of her standing. The Ashbourne house now welcomed speakers, painters, former labourers, teachers, and children. There was no dress code, no calling card requirement. Only an invitation to belong. Cassius had paid the price, of course. Some ventures never recovered, old alliances dissolved, but something better had taken root. He spoke now at universities, not boardrooms, and sat on the city council for housing reform. They called him radical. He accepted it. Clara had gone on to teach full-time at the asylum and was soon to marry a kind-hearted carpenter who adored her resolve. Annie, now a teenager, illustrated children's primers in her spare time and still argued with Clara over syntax. And Eugenia Rathbone. Rumour had it she tried to reclaim her place in Parisian society, but failed to hold anyone's gaze for long. Her name had become a footnote, a cautionary tale told in the hush of gilded salons. Morgan shifted slightly as the baby kicked. "Do you remember," she asked softly, "when I told you not to perform?" Cassius reached for her hand. "Yes." "You didn't. Not once." He kissed her knuckles. "I learned there is nothing more sacred than being real with the person you love." She turned to him, her eyes bright with the weight of years and something deeper than joy, something earned. Below the cliffs, as the sun began to set, the sea lavender bloomed again. It always did, and this time it was not just a symbol, it was a legacy. In the end, when she stopped begging for his love, is not just a story about a cold magnate and a forgotten wife. It is a story about reclaiming dignity in silence, about the kind of love that blooms not from longing, but from recognition. Morgan Ashbourne did not fight for attention. She grew roots, and in choosing to stand still, she transformed a man who had never been taught how to reach. This tale reminds us that true strength is often quiet, that transformation takes time, and that the deepest bonds are built not in grand gestures, but in the everyday choice to stay, to grow, to see. If this story touched your heart, if you felt something stir with each chapter, we invite you to leave a comment below. Let us know what part stayed with you, and if you read until the very end, write the word lavender in your comment, so we'll know you walked with Morgan and Cassius all the way to the cliff's edge and back. If you wish to support the storytellers who bring these emotional journeys to life, consider sending a super thanks with any amount you feel moved to give. It helps us keep creating these period dramas that linger in your heart long after the screen fades to black. And if a contribution isn't possible today, you can still help more than you know, by sharing this story with someone who loves powerful romance, or by watching the next dramatic tale we've left for you in the cards. Thank you for being here. Thank you for believing in stories like this. And remember, sometimes the most extraordinary kind of love is the one that waits for us when we finally stop chasing.